side, it says we're live and streaming.
Yep, we're ready. Okay. Well, welcome everyone. Deeply appreciate you taking some time from your lunch hour to join us today. As always, I hope everyone is doing well, healthy, and staying safe. It gives me tremendous pleasure. Well, first let me introduce myself, sorry. I'm Dr. James Broomall, an associate professor at Shepherd University, as well as the director of the George Tyler Moore Center for the Study of the Civil War. And it gives me tremendous pleasure today to introduce my friend and colleague, Dana Shoaf. Dana is the editor of Civil War Times. He is a familiar face to many of you from his fantastic live stream programs on the first Mondays. For those of you who know the Center's programming, we featured Dana in our seminar at Gettysburg 2 years ago, where he did a great battlefield program, and he will be delivering the keynote address for our October program coming up in 2020. And so it's wonderful to have him here. And what we're going to do today is talk about something that I think is incredibly commonplace. If you were a child who visited Civil War battlefields and you're allowed to take home one souvenir, it might very well have been a mini ball. They're relatively ubiquitous, relatively inexpensive, and perhaps some of those mini balls start these huge collections. But this is a pretty complex little piece of material culture and artifact that's interfaces with social aspects of the war, technological aspects of the war, military aspects of the conflict. And so Dana is going to sort of reveal or unmask the mini ball for us today, drawing not only upon his store of knowledge, but also upon the collection that he has accumulated over the past couple of years. And so we're going to use this one artifact and its many different iterations to explore this larger sociocultural and military world. And so with that, let me just ask a broad question, Dana. What exactly are we talking about here with the Minié or the mini ball? I mean, this is a term that we all hear, we read about, but what exactly do we mean?
Sure. Well, before I begin, I'd like to thank you for having me on today, Jim. I really appreciate it. I love the association with the George Tyler Moore Center. I really appreciate it. And actually, it was a program that you had put on that sort of inspired me to go back and start collecting on a small scale these bullets from the Civil War. I want to say that I don't have as an extensive collection as there's collectors out there that have hundreds of bullets. I don't have that many. Most of the bullets I have are relatively inexpensive, between $2 and $25. I've paid more than that for some, but there are actually bullets out there that go for $700 to $1,500. They're very rare and expensive. I don't have anything like that. But as you were saying, I think when people go to a battlefield, and if they take one actual Civil War item home with them, it's going to be what we call a mini bullet. And of course, what we're talking about, here's a basic Federal example I'm going to hold up. A 3-ring conical bullet shaped like a cone with a hollow base that will expand when the musket is fired with gas from the exploding gunpowder. That base will swell and the rings of the base will catch the rifling of the musket barrel. And then, of course, that gives the bullet accuracy. Now, for hundreds of years, basically simple round bullets like so, this is about a 72 caliber round musket ball, were the standard bullet used by common infantrymen in a line of battle. And the reason that was, as many people know, because black powder burns, leaves a residue. And if the bullet fits too tightly, you can't ram it down after a couple shots. So there were specialized riflemen that did have rifling or a series of grooves cut in the barrel to give this round ball. They still use round balls accuracy, but it took so much time to load those. It was much harder to do. So they gave these common soldiers smoothbores. Now, in the late 1840s, a French captain, and he's just one of several people named Claude Minié, experiments with how do I make rifling work for common soldiers? And he comes up with this idea of making a conical bullet that's smaller than the barrel, so it will theoretically still load quickly when the barrel's fouled, but to compensate for that and to allow it to catch the rifling, he makes it with a hollow base. But Minié's bullet had an iron cup in it. Okay. There was an iron cup, basically a little iron cup that was jammed in the base of the bullet. When the gun was fired, that iron cup was driven up into the bullet, and he believed that was necessary to spread out the base of the bullet. Fast forward a little bit to the United States, and James Burton, an armorer at the Harpers Ferry Arsenal, not far from us.
Local connection.
He's actually buried in Winchester. In the mid 1850s, early to mid 1850s, he experiments with this bullet, and he says, you know, we don't need that iron cup. We don't need a wedge in there to drive that forward. If the base of the bullet is deep enough and the rings are, you know, cut deep enough, that's enough for that bullet to catch the rifling, and it will work. And by doing that, he saves a big production step, right? And you can make these things much more quickly and mass produce these lead slugs that weigh about an ounce or so, okay? So that's a quick story of how the conical ball, as it was often called formerly, but Americans generally call it the mini bullet, right? Or the mini ball. But maybe we should call it the Burton bullet, because he's the one that actually, right, develops the one that is mostly used during the Civil War. So, you know, I was cleaning the house one day, and there was a chest of drawers in our house, and you were saying, how did I get interested in this? And I was cleaning it, and I found bullets I bought when I was a kid, you know? And I was looking at them, and I thought, you know, I really need to put these in a better storage. You know, there's some, you know, they're just kind of banging around in this plastic little box. And I was looking at them, and I'm like, wow, even these 58 caliber bullets, you know, typical Union bullets are slightly different. And so I got looking at that, and then I went and heard a talk, and I'll mention that again, at your center. And it really made me realize how many varieties of mini bullets there were, mini balls. And so I like old industry. That's another thing I'm interested in. And I like the process of it. So I started to collect them, because most of them were inexpensive. And then I did spend some more money on some of these things.
As happens, right?
Right. And, you know, in the process of learning, you know, I found out these bullets were cast. They were punched out of lead cylinder, basically lead wire that would run through a machine and press them. Some of them were actually made by partially pressing them and partially turning them on a lathe. Some are wholly turned on a lathe. So, you know, I kept getting pulled into this and to look at the variants of them. And so I have a decent collection that shows you a range of different types of bullets. And this has kind of led me to a larger idea about rifling and the mini ball and its technological consequence for the Civil War. Okay. And I'll get into that sort of at the end, you know.
Okay. I was going to say, I mean, for a neophyte, I mean, maybe it would be useful actually at this juncture to say, I mean, is this truly the technological marvel that maybe popular culture has portrayed it? And I think the old shibboleth is basically right, that these sort of inept officers are still couched in a Napoleonic era, are not aware of the modern marvels of technology, and therefore are leading lambs to the slaughter. I'm not saying I agree with that, of course, but that's, I think, a very popular idea that circulates
I think, you know,
authors. And
like I said, I think, and, you know, we can readdress this at the end as well, but, you know, it's not a bad idea to discuss it now. So, like, you know, you go to a battlefield, right? And you go to any relic store, you know, Sharpsburg or Gettysburg or Fredericksburg or, you know, Richmond area, and there's bins of mini balls, right? You go to the battlefields and you see monuments with mini balls on them, you know, topped with mini balls. There are veteran reunion ribbons that have little mini ball pendants or even an image of a mini ball on it. And it's really become sort of a symbol of the Civil War, right? The mini ball. Yeah. And, you know, rifling and the mini ball is what made the Civil War so deadly, because these guns are accurate and the technology allowed them to shoot further and straighter than ever before, you know, in the hands of a massive amount of men. Not just specialist riflemen have these anymore, common soldiers. So I have two theories, and I think one probably will get, I need to do more research on this, but, you know, one I could see people attacking, and the other I feel is pretty ironclad. And my one theory is I'm not sure how much rifling and the mini ball actually matter.
Okay. Yeah.
Because when you combine, people I've gone, I participated in living history, and I've often heard people give talks about their rifle muskets, and the sights are set up to go to 1,000 yards, and you could shoot these things accurately at 1,000 yards. Well, has anyone ever actually looked at what a human being looks like at 1,000 yards?
Yeah.
They're miniature. And of course, in the pandemonium of battle with smoke and uneven terrain and the chaos, who's really aiming that much? You're pointing and shooting, right? Most of the time. And you add that with haphazard training. Some regiments were trained more thoroughly than others. How accurate are these guys really with these bullets? Now, understandably, if you get hit by one of these big old lead slugs, it's going to cause incredible damage that leads to disease and possible amputation. But is that the result of accuracy that you get hit? That sort of thing. Well, it made me think two things. One, this is an example to show people another round. I can't put this on the thing, but this is a actual buck and ball round. This is a 69 caliber round ball with 3 32 caliber buckshots attached to it. This is how it was dug in Virginia, actually, and they're fused together. Okay, that goes in a smoothbore, not a rifled musket. This is a cartridge. Buck and ball cartridge, a really neat. You can see the buckshot are wrapped separately from the round ball there, and most of the killing in the Civil War is done at 80 yards, right? Roughly, and if you think about it on a football field, right? You and Jim, our gridiron experience, right? We played college ball, didn't we? Okay, no one's going to believe that. No one's going to believe that. But no, use a football field as a frame of reference, right? At 80 yards, these smoothbores with buck and ball are going to be, close enough, right, in accuracy. And if you get hit with a 32 caliber ball, it's much smaller, but you can still die of disease from that.
Sure.
So I started, wondering, and what it turned me to think about is the other aspect of technology of this time period, which we don't talk about that much, and that is, this is going to possibly be hard to see, the percussion cap. You can see this little, maybe I have to hold it, looks like a little top hat, basically. It's made out of copper, and inside was a cap made out of fulminate of mercury. And of course, what a soldier would do would be to tear open that cartridge, pour the powder and the bullet into the barrel, ram it down with the paper for a wadding, and then go to the lock or the hammer mechanism, half cock it, and put this percussion cap on the cone or nipple, full cock the weapon, and when the trigger is pulled, the hammer comes down, pops this cap, a spark drops through the cone into the powder charge and ignites it. Okay? This is what I think is the real technological revolution, because prior to the Civil War, muskets were largely flintlocks in these major wars, right? Uses a piece of stone to create a spark that sets off powder, which ignites the barrel charge, okay? And flintlocks, are not reliable in wet weather or damp weather. They misfire a lot. And I will indict you as well, Jim, because you and I both have done living history, Yeah. And even in reenacting, when we take a flintlock out, it's going to misfire at some point. And and when you take out a percussion weapon, I mean, I've fired thousands of rounds out of these in my ridiculous reenacting hobby over the years. How many misfires have I had with a percussion? Maybe a couple, And so this reliable ignition system is what allows a lot of lead in the air, right? Guns are not misfiring and guys can fire at will. So there's constantly bullets being shot. And so I think that is really the technological revolution. And I'll conclude this and then you can ask a question. But if you armed men in the Civil War and gave them bullets that had used mini balls and rifling, but had flintlock mechanisms, the war's not going to be as deadly because you're not going to have, Sherman couldn't have marched to the sea with flintlocks. He wouldn't have been able to do that because he would have been concerned about, fighting in inclement weather with an unreliable ignition system.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, in preparation for today, I was rereading some of the, like your tin mug there, Dana. I was rereading.
This is just water. This is water.
That's good. It's only noon, so
yeah, I know.
We're still all on coffee and water.
Right. Yeah.
Rereading some of the works, and you know what's striking is, and it's not conjecture, but it's not definitive. But one of the things that I read is that basically it takes around 200 rounds to inflict one casualty at the Battle of Gettysburg. There's that much lead that's in the air.
Right.
The Union Army going into Gettysburg has issued 5.4 million rounds of ammunition.
Yes.
And so I think one of the things that you say is absolutely correct. The rate of fire has increased. The accuracy has certainly increased.
Right.
But at the same time, though, there's just a lot of ineffective firing. I mean, and what I want to highlight and what you alluded to is that these men are, despite the training, they're scared. Their comrades, their family, their friends are being killed around them. They themselves may literally be experiencing their final moments on Earth. So no matter how much training, they themselves are frightened. It's gone jaundiced their opinion of things. Right. It's gone make the process they know so well a little more haphazard and shaky. Then on top of that, you put in the literal smoke, because of course this is the era before smokeless black powder. So it's obscuring the battlefield. Then put on the topography. And down you go down the line, and you could all of a sudden see how even the best trained of soldiers is extraordinarily unlikely in some instances to hit the enemy.
Right.
And just very quickly, there was a quick question about sharpshooters, and I'm not sure if we want to go down that path, but suffice it to say, a lot of what Dana's talking about is applicable to the 54, 58, .577 caliber weapons that the infantry carried. Sharpshooters are kind of an entirely different discussion. Right. They had specialized weaponry, which was actually incredibly accurate at extraordinarily high distances.
Right.
Berdan's sharpshooters are among the most famous for that.
Right.
So
they usually use the Sharps rifle, and this is actually a Sharps rifle bullet that I have. And interestingly, just a little off the wrap, this is that's not a conical based bullet. That's an entirely different bullet because it's a breech loader. So you're forcing the bullet from the breech out, so it doesn't have to be as loose in a breech loader. It's a different mechanism. And you know, like Berdan's sharpshooters, or even there were sharpshooter regiments that used conventional muzzle loaders with the conical ball we're talking about, with the hollow base. But those guys, their job is to aim, is to take their time when they're shooting, right? They're not, we're talking about rank and file guys, typical guys in a typical regiment going into battle in linear tactics and opening fire. And quickly about the percussion cap, the percussion cap is what renders muzzle loaders obsolete, because this percussion cap still exists. We just use it, and it's now a center fire cartridge. Right, you just took the percussion cap and it was integrated in a brass cartridge very shortly after the Civil War. So this technological change is still with us, the percussion cap. It's just been merged into a cartridge. And my argument is that instead of volley firing, as you would have seen in the 18th century, so to speak, you know, commands to fire at will are given much more freely in the Civil War. Fire by file was actually a command, and it changes between these manuals, and I don't have them in front of me. But by the time of the Civil War and in the percussion cap, right, fire by file is different than it is in the 18th century. And it's designed to stagger your firing. So you begin firing on the right side of your company or regiment, and it goes to the left. So that theoretically, by the time these guys on the left are done shooting, the guys on the right have reloaded, and there's constantly lead going down range, right? In the Face of Battle, Keegan's famous book, he talks about how on an 18th century battlefield, you would have heard a tremendous crash when a volley is fired. And then there's sort of dead air in some cases, right? As these guys are reloading, allowing these troops to close with the bayonet. You know, I'm simplifying, but I'm making the point. That doesn't really happen in the Civil War. Somebody's always generally pulling a trigger. And, you know, like a famous quote from Bronner's Farm by Gibbon, I believe, is a gunfire sounded like the tearing of a sailcloth or the tearing of a sheet. Just constant roar, you know, of musketry the whole time. And that's the percussion cap at work as much as the mini ball and the rifling aspect of it.
Sure. And I think most of our, I'm sorry, I'm trying to follow these comments here. And so we got some questions and I got to start lobbing at you, Dana. Before we get into we also have to get into the artifacts themselves that you have. So we got a lot of ground to cover here in 30 minutes. You know, an infantryman was issued 40 rounds, and they would, in many instances before battle, be issued an additional 20 to 40 rounds, thereby bringing themselves to around 60 to 80 rounds. The excess rounds are held in the knapsack, additional weight for the soldiers. The rate of fire ideally is 3 aim shots a minute. In actuality,
that's ideal. I don't think that's actually realized. Even though I'm talking rate of fire, I think it's closer to 2 rounds a minute. But that's right.
And I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that's even slower than that. One shot every couple minutes, if it's a prolonged firefight, simply because the expenditure of bullets would occur too quickly.
Right.
And you do have famous instances like the 20th Maine's charge down Lower Round Top is because of low ammunition, among other things. At the unfinished railroad cuts at Second Manassas, the Confederates are literally using rocks because they're out of ammunition. You have all these instances where the rounds did run low. But to sort of bring this back real quick here, do you have any thoughts on Earl Hess's work? So that's one of the questions.
I'm in the process of reading his works, and I don't think Hess touches. I don't think I've read anything that really touches on the percussion cap.
No, I agree.
You know what I mean? From Attack and Die to Hess's works, Hess actually does say in some of his books, most of the fighting's done within 80 yards, right? And his rifling. He doesn't really. Earl Hess is a great scholar, and I respect him, but he doesn't really bring in the percussion cap. He does kind of get close and say, the 80-yard thing, and did rifling really matter? But he doesn't really press it home. At least in my opinion, with the percussion cap. But he's a great scholar to read. To take a look at this stuff. Absolutely. But I want to let me show some of the artifacts. Is that okay?
Yeah, and this will wrap back to another question, which will directly go into the artifacts. And so let's sort of redirect here, because I think we can talk at length about effective ranges and killing zones, which I think are incredibly useful topics, and we've touched upon. And there's some interesting thread comments going on right now to help direct some of those discussions. But
that's cool. Yeah.
Dana has a pretty interesting artifact collection, and so one of the questions that has been raised thus far is, are these being made in depots? And I think my question then is, can you give us some specific examples, the North Carolina one we'll get to, of places of manufacture and just the sheer variance?
Yeah,
I'll think of this one basic same thing, but that's not at all in truth how complicated these artifacts work.
There are a number of arsenals in the North and in the South. And I can identify some of the Southern ones where they were made actually a little more easily than the Northern ones. In some cases, because they're distinctive variants. It's interesting. I'm going to start looking at an artifact here. Okay. So this is a standard. Let me ask you, Jim. Okay. I'm holding it on this. Is that better if I hold it like this?
I like it on the platform.
Okay,
so people can start commenting if they want.
This is a standard Union 58 caliber 3-ring bullet. But if you look in the base, and I think we tried this beforehand, I think you can see there's a star. This is a bullet that was stamped out in a bullet machine. Can everyone see the star in the base? Yeah, Can you see that?
Yep.
So that's kind of a cool thing, right?
Yeah.
And collectors kind of develop a nomenclature, and they call this the Washington Arsenal bullet.
Okay.
The Washington Arsenal did not make bullets.
Okay.
So in many cases, they don't know where these bullets are made, actually. And no one is really sure where this bullet was produced, at least in the sources that I've read. Okay. So and then you won't be able to see it in this. Here's another variant. There's a US stamped in the base of this, the initials US. That's really hard to see. I don't know if we can see it.
Yeah, that one's pretty tough.
But this bullet really intrigues me. This is a Northern made bullet, but it's bigger. Here, I'll put it next. See how it's taller?
Oh, yeah.
See the variant there? Now, if you really get into fussiness about this, right? Different weight bullets require different aiming measures if you're going to be a real accurate, you know, shooter with these things. And so this bullet was partially stamped. The nose was stamped in a machine, and then it was actually taken and put on a lathe. And you see those marks in the base from the chuck, where it was put on a lathe, and then the grooves were cut on a lathe. So it's made in 2 different steps. All right, that's again a documented northern issue bullet.
Now, why are they stamping them, Dana?
It's mass production.
Okay, so this is a story about industrialization, among other things.
They developed in the North more than the South, actually. They had bullet stamping machines, okay, that basically you took like a cylinder, a long cylinder of lead, if you will, and fed it into the machine, and it would chunk off the length, and it would put it in a die, and it would stamp out a bullet. And another die would come in and punch the base, you know, and that's how you get those stampings inside. Stamping is better than casting because when you cast something with hot metal and you pour lead in a mold, and there's all different ways to cast something, and I'll show you this bullet here. This is a 69 caliber because they actually rifled some of those smoothbores we talked about, and they use these massive 69 caliber bullets in them. And let me find if I can get it. I don't know if people can see this or not, but there is a slight pencil mark. You see the circle of pencil dots around there? I don't know if you can see that. It's a circle.
Around the base, around the top?
Around the cone, on the cone. Look on the cone. Do you see a circle?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, that circle is around a sprue because when this was cast, it's called side cast. The mold was upside down and the lead was poured in right here.
Oh, okay.
That's where the lead was poured in. So this is a side cast bullet. But casting, if you don't have the mold has to be hot as well because you can get air bubbles, right? And if you get air bubbles, you can have what's called a blow through, okay? This is a 58 caliber Union bullet that's had a blow through. You can see right through it. Can you see through it? Okay. Now, if I'm going to try to stand it up, you can see how when that bullet was fired, there was a bubble in it, and the entire bullet, I don't know if it'll stand, just basically ruptured.
Okay.
So how accurate was that going to be?
Sure.
And these are not that uncommon. You know, I bought this off of eBay, and I didn't pay that much for it. You know, it's not like relic hunters never find these things, you know? So they've got bullets even that are not functioning properly. And that's an example of it. And and I want to show you this other experimental round. 2 more experimental rounds. We can talk about that too.
Okay.
This is, I don't think I can get this. Yeah, I can get it to stand. This is a Gardner bullet. This is G-A-R-D-I-N-E-R, Gardner, if you will. His name was Samuel Gardner, and this is an explosive bullet, and it's a different color. You notice how it's darker compared to your basic lead bullet that's oxidized over time? That's because this bullet is made out of pewter. Because they wanted this bullet to be harder, because if you look at the base, there was a powder charge inside this bullet. And when the musket was fired, it was just the ignition would cause there's a compound in that little sort of nipple on the base, you see, that would slowly burn through. And ideally, when this thing hits somebody or is in a, you know, reaches a body of enemy troops, it blows up. And the fragments will hit people and take them out. And they wanted, and lead was too soft to explode properly, so they made them out of pewter, which was harder and would shatter better. It's pretty barbaric when you think about it. They weren't very effective, however, and you know, there was an experimental round. Another experimental round was by a man named 2 guys named Reuben and Ira Schaefer, who developed the 3-piece Shaler bullet, 3 mini balls in one, right? Okay. If you take this apart, you see how they stack, okay? And the idea was when this was fired, it would break into 3 rounds, and it would triple the effectiveness of your gunfire.
Yikes.
Now there's variants of these. I won't get into all of them. Basically, I'll show you two. I have three. There's three main variants. One had a sort of a short, stumpy top one, top hat, if you will, and the other one has a longer cone. They were wholly pretty unsuccessful as well. They didn't really break apart, and they had a tremendous recoil. When these guys used them, that big mass of lead really bucked into your shoulder. But what I'm getting at is here's a 58 caliber. I'll use it to show you the 54 caliber bullet. This bullet was wholly turned on a lathe, and you can see that the rings are a little. You see how they're not sort of indented, or they don't have an angle to them.
Right.
Entirely turned on a lathe. These are often dug in conjunction with where Ohio troops camped earlier in the war. So maybe they were made somewhere in Ohio for some reason. But the point is, the mini ball is an experimental bullet, right? People are still trying to figure out how to make this thing. It's not like there's one set way to make the perfect mini ball. Do we cast them? Do we stamp them out? Will this work better, or will that work better? And throughout the whole war, there's all these variances. Do you want to take a question, or do you want me to look at some Confederate bullets?
Well, I want to transition us to another specific artifact, and it's gone entwined with a question. And so there's a couple experts on this comment forum, I know. And so one of the more authoritative voices had noted that this is a period in which sometimes there's poor quality black powder.
Yes.
There's the likelihood of fouling. And so again, for those of you who maybe are less familiar with this technology, Dana's going to show us in a second a cleaning round, but suffice it to say this before we get there, these soldiers are firing at, in some instances, very high rates, and are forced off the line to allow their rifled muskets to cool, in some cases to unfoul them, to clean them. The fight at Culp's Hill, for instance, the Union line is in a very desperate struggle, and behind the row of monuments they can travel on today, there's this gully on the reverse side slope. That's where a lot of Union troops are taking shelter in the midst of this severe firefight that goes on for hours and hours and hours and hours. It's one of the really crystal clear examples of a protracted firefight during the Civil War, and their rifled muskets are constantly fouling. Well, the government has a solution to that, for that rather. And so I want to turn now to a very specific item that you have, Dana, in your collection, and talk a little bit about the purpose of this so-called cleaner round, right, and show us something that is a really unique artifact for audiences who haven't seen it in its toto form.
Sure. So as we've said, and as the commenter said, black powder leaves a lot of residue behind, and just to the idea, what I should say, let me just, this will make sense. Okay. So this is a 54 caliber cartridge, your basic cartridge, sort of a tan or off-white paper. Okay. So inside here, and I don't want to pull it up because it's original, but you see the tail. The soldier would grasp that between his teeth, tear it open, pour out the black powder up here, invert it, squeeze out the bullet, and then allow the paper to stay in the barrel as wadding, okay? The bullet is waxed because it's to help facilitate loading. But you and I know, we've live fired these rifle muskets. You get a couple, 3 rounds in these things, and all of a sudden it's like, wow, I got to pound this thing down, wax round or not, right? You're jamming it down, and that's when we kind of have this epiphany, like, they're not getting 3 rounds a minute off, no way. And even though this thing's supposed to facilitate rapid fire, it's like you're jamming it. So the government realized there's a problem with this, and there was I forget his first name, but his last name was Williams, who developed sort of this cleaner round. And can you see the little stem there? They came in 54 and 58 calibers as well, various calibers. But this is a type 2. And when this bullet was fired, the base was supposed to push up, and there was a zinc washer that's missing from this example that was then expand out, and it was supposed to scour that rifling and clean it as it exited the barrel, so that you would clean out that rifling. And those cartridges were color coded with blue paper. It was sometimes red, I believe, too, but usually they're blue.
And this is the original, right, Dana?
This is an original Williams cleaner cartridge, yes.
That's incredible.
That's one of those cleaner rounds in it. And so they started out putting 1 per 10, and then I think they increased it to 2 per, because each pack of cartridges has 10 rounds in it. A soldier's issued that he opens up and puts in his cartridge box. And it started out, they put 1 per 10, and then I think they increased it to 2 per 10 because, you know, it's a problem. You know, are they effective or not? You know, that's argumentative if they were really effective. There is another variant. There's a type 1, which also used, I can't stand it, but there would have been a couple zinc washers on this, and there's a stem, and it's the same idea. The gun going off expands those washers to scour the barrel, the Williams cleaner rounds. And so those would have been in northern cartridge boxes. Now, you want me to shift to talk about the English rounds now, or do you want another question?
Let's shift. I mean, we got about 15 minutes here, okay. So let's shift to English rounds, okay. And then get
while I'm looking at those cartridges, I wanted to point out something. This is an English cartridge, okay? So everybody knows that the Confederacy and the Federals imported weapons and ammunition from Great Britain.
And in incredibly high numbers, as
incredibly high numbers. So the English cartridges are made differently. Now, I have to put my reading glasses on. This one was made by a contractor E&A Ludlow, Birmingham. Kind of gives you get a sense of how a little bit fussier the English manufacturing system was. Every one of his cartridges, they had a paper label attached to it, so you knew where it came from. E.A. Ludlow, okay?
Incredible.
Now, this cartridge is made differently from the American cartridge. In the American cartridge, the base of the bullet, I'm going to probably get this wrong myself, is facing up, okay? So when you tear it open, you pour the powder in, and the top of the bullet, you have to invert upside down the cartridge, right? To get the bullet in there, in the mini ball. The English cartridge, you tore off with this little tail, you dump the powder out, and then you would turn the cartridge around again, and then the outside of English cartridges were waxed, not the bullet. And so this entire piece of paper sits in there, and then it's rammed down. Now, I don't have, there's an example. So this is another thing, right? So this is an English cartridge. You have to load it differently, right? So guys get confused. And here is a standard 58 caliber bullet, right? And these English cartridges could be used in, you know, the same weapon as a 58 caliber. This looks normal, except this bullet was actually pulled, meaning a soldier rammed it down and had to pull it out. But whoever rammed it down the wrong way. It was rammed down upside down.
It would be useful because I think the comments vary in kind of what kind of knowledge people bring into this discussion. When you say pull around, I think you should describe what that actually is.
Exactly. So I have a number of bullets as well that show evidence of being loaded and then pulled out by this hole, okay? So a soldier would have rammed this bullet down his gun barrel, and then he might have been assigned to go out on picket duty. So he's done with picket duty, he's called back. He's not supposed to discharge his firearm necessarily. They may have had orders not to. So he is going to take what's called a worm. What I call a worm. I hope that's, yeah. And so that's a tool that you attach, you thread onto the opposite end of your ramrod, you put it down your barrel, and you turn that, and that will screw into the bullet, and then you use the ramrod to pull the bullet out, or pull it without firing the gun. And you just take the bullet off that thread and throw it on the ground and walk away. So you find, you know, I've got a whole bunch of bullets, all different calibers, different makes that were pulled. And I like these because here's a Williams cleaner that was pulled. Okay, the cleaner we just talked about, here's one that was pulled and thrown on the ground.
And let me just quickly add, Brandon Bice has joined us, who's the superintendent of Manassas Battlefield.
Well, here goes the party now with Brandon.
A very good dear friend of both Dana and I. But Brandon has some an interesting link to an archaeological investigation done down in Tennessee on the Williams rounds. So Brandon
is a superintendent. He has a wealth of knowledge. about this stuff, and I'm sure whatever he has is fascinating. And I'm just going to extrapolate a little bit and say, one of the things I want people to understand is, the study of these bullets is interesting, and we can learn a lot from them. And that's kind of what the bigger picture is. Don't just think that the simple lead slug. We can learn about industry. We can learn about the soldiers themselves. We can learn about, tactics from looking at what apparently is a simple, affordable piece of Civil War material culture. And anyway, so this bullet was rammed down upside down. And somebody had to take a smaller lead slug because, of course, the base of these is conical. So when he was trying to catch it with his worm to pull it out, he couldn't. So they jammed down another piece of lead, like a pistol ball or something, to get this thing pulled out upside down. And I don't have any in my collection, but there are a number of relic hunters that have Enfield bullets that were rammed down the wrong way, because these guys are getting interchangeable ammunition sometimes, Again, that's going to inhibit accuracy if your bullet's upside down, okay? So I don't know how much time we have, but I have 3 Confederate bullets, at least 4 I want to show quickly.
Yeah, well, we certainly have time for that, and I think it would be useful to pause here and just sort of, so
Cool.
we've talked a lot about Northern industry, and then now we're going to transition a bit. And, in this instance, when the Confederacy is created, they have to, in some ways, build much of their industry from scratch. There is an industry in Birmingham, Alabama, Richmond, Virginia, Atlanta, Georgia, and so on down the line. But I mean, in some instances, they are quite literally creating swords from plowshares, or plowshares into swords. And so this sort of transitions our conversation into a very different type of artifact, in some instances a rarer artifact, and some really interesting social history when you get to the example of the North Carolina piece. And so with that, let's turn it over to some of these Confederate pieces that you have.
Okay. One of the things that's interesting about the Confederacy is that you have sort of bullets with regional identities. For example, there are bullets that are found at Trans-Mississippi theater sites like Pea Ridge and Wilson's Creek. You don't find them anywhere else, and so you can see there's a lot of evidence of local manufacture on the Confederate side. And one of the bullets that really I saw, like I said when we began, I found that little collection I had when I was a kid, and that kind of got me reinterested. And then I went to hear the talk, and I can't think of the archaeologist's name that I went, the former head archaeologist for the
Stephen Potter.
Stephen Potter gave a great talk about bullet archaeology in the Piper Orchard and what we could learn from the bullets. It was fascinating. And one of the things he showed a slide of was a bullet that looked like this. I had never seen a bullet that looked like this. And I'm like, that is one ugly, weird looking bullet. And so he explained that this was made at the Raleigh School for the Deaf, Dumb, and Blind in Raleigh, North Carolina. That they turned that over to have the students make bullets for the North Carolina war effort. And when they find these bullets, they're always associated with North Carolina troops. They were almost uniquely issued to North Carolina soldiers. This one is 69 caliber. Here is a 54 caliber version next to it. And then, let me set this down briefly. This is a 58 caliber version of that same bullet. They made them all different calibers. The 58 caliber bullets are the rarest. They could go for a couple $100. I didn't pay that much for this one because it's damaged on the backside. It's not 100%. I paid a lot less for this one, but it's a good example of the 58 caliber. But they've got these crude bullets, and you could see the rings that are supposed to catch the rifling. The bottom ring isn't even wholly formed on that one. It's much better formed on this one. They're sort of misshapen. They don't sit straight up and down. So you get a sense of this sort of ad hoc local manufacture in these bullets made at this school. And with apologies to the WHO, you know what they say. This. Those deaf, dumb, and blind kids sure make a mean mini ball. I'm sorry, I have to use that because I have to use that because I think, so anyway, so here's one example of this local manufactured stuff. Also in North Carolina, and I wasn't going to show this, often associated with North Carolina troops is what they call the Austrian bullet, which is this very sort of ancient looking bullet that doesn't have a conical base. It's got a flat base, but the idea was that when you fired it, because the grooves were so deep, the bottom would squish up and still catch the rifling. And you see that often attributed to, it's believed that they got molds from overseas and were producing them in the Confederacy.
Okay.
Okay, so let me show you a couple of things quickly too. You see, this is a French imported French bullet, 69 caliber. I have a 58 caliber bullet too. Okay, that's French, and you can identify French bullets because instead of a round opening, it's triangular. So you can still see various countries are trying to figure out how to make the bullet. Now, what's interesting, compare that French 58 caliber with an American-made 58. Look how much smaller the French bullet is.
Sure.
So, and then one of the more common, two more I'll show people, is the Gardner round. No, don't confuse it with the explosive Gardner. Frederick Gardner, Gardner, also made bullets for the Confederacy. This was his particular bullet. You see it has one big bottom ring and a narrower middle ring. What's interesting about this bullet is, and I hope you can see it, can you see the little line in the base? There's sort of two circles of lead there.
Yeah, yeah.
Because, and I have a damaged one that I purchased, 69 caliber, and it's bent back, but you can see those two layers of lead because the paper cartridge was actually crimped in between those two layers. Okay. So the bullet is exposed and the paper cartridge extends below it. A couple problems with that. That's a fragile connection. They often tore, right? They're not reliable. And the Gardner bullets were also notorious because look, I don't know if you can see how deep that base is. It's almost too deep, right? So those were well known for blow throughs, just like this is a Gardner blow through. Another bullet, when it was fired, it had a casting flaw in it and the hole was so deep in the base, it just ruptures right through. So again, you can see through it. So again, not that uncommon for people to find. So how accurate is that? Of course, it's not going to be very accurate, right?
Right.
So, and then one last thing, and I'll take a breath for people to talk about, but the Enfield bullet that went in this paper cartridge, the British didn't have any rings on their bullets. You see how that bullet is entirely smooth? They don't think that rings are necessary, okay? They never get away from having a separate piece in the base. There's the conical base, but every Enfield round had a little tapered beechwood plug in the base. Okay? And this is one with the plug in the base. It's still in there. And when the gun was fired, the idea was the plug would force itself forward and expand this smooth bullet to catch the rifling. Now that, again, the English are a little slower and fussier in their production process, right? So, they still somebody has to, run a lathe to turn out millions of these little beechwood plugs that go in every round.
Sure.
And then they have to assemble those rounds. So, again, the bigger picture is that the mini ball is really experimental, right? What I'm calling all these as a mini ball, different countries make them different ways. People are still trying to figure out how to make these things and who makes the best mini ball. And the Civil War ends and this all goes away pretty quickly when breech loaders take over, So again, it's not really this perfect round, that is this, everybody knows how to use extremely well.
Yeah, and I think more broadly, and we'll start bringing it home here. More broadly, I think what's interesting is this. I think should compel people to think seriously about material culture, right? Because we at the outside were to look at a mini ball and take it at face value, assume that all of them are commonplace, I think we'd be missing this huge piece of social, cultural, technological, military history. And by taking the artifact on its own terms and looking at that artifact in its different variations, we're exposed to this very complex world that gets to the things like percussion caps and killing ranges and social issues and the international trade. And I think what Dana has demonstrated today so clearly and so powerfully is that, again, material culture can speak if we're willing to listen, and if we're willing to research more deeply and understand all these different variants and how it can just tell this whole multiplicity of different stories. And I think maybe you mentioned it briefly, but to just close on, just tell us one more time, because I think this is so interesting and so powerful. The mini ball itself, as you stated, becomes this symbol in many ways. And so it is something that we see on monuments, on reunion medals. We associate it probably more clearly with the American Civil War than almost anything else, I would argue.
Right.
I mean, I think it demonstrates the importance, right?
I do. And I think it's kind of interesting that you take this simple, tiny little piece of material culture that you could still go and buy for $2 in many cases, all over the place, right? And, it has become a symbol of the Civil War. And kind of very tightly connected to that, of course, is that, people will say, oh, this is the mini ball. And with rifling, this is what changed the war, the technology that changed tactics, that rendered linear tactics obsolete, that made soldiers accurate, killing machines. And the reality, I think, is a lot more complex. And left out of that story is the percussion cap, the ignition system. Just to give you an example, okay? Like I said, let's say the Civil War was fought with the same bullets and rifling, but people were using flintlocks, right? The old ignition system where the ignition powder is exposed to the weather. How many battles were called off during the Revolutionary War because of rain, even dampness, high humidity, right? Would make a commander think twice about launching an attack. In the Civil War, fighting occurs all day at Spotsylvania in a rainstorm. How many men are killed that day because of the percussion cap? Because officers know that those guns are still going to go off. Phil Kearny is mortally wounded at Chantilly during a battle that takes place in a driving rainstorm, okay? He's probably not going to be killed if they're using flintlocks, okay? And he's just an example of one casualty. Again, Sherman is not going to maybe have the confidence to march across Georgia in the middle of winter, when it's going to rain. This is one of the reasons armies went into winter camps, not just because the roads were a quagmire. They were still a quagmire in the Civil War when Grant and Sherman decided to launch the year-round war. But who knows, I'm not saying Grant and Sherman that think, oh, well, we've got the percussion cap, we can do it now, right? But that percussion cap is what allows that year-round fighting as much as anything, because they got guns that'll go off now. And you and I know through reenacting, I've loaded and fired in a rain and drizzle. And after a while, of course, yes, it's ineffective. But it's amazing how they often do fire, even when it's raining,
Well, and I think that lays bare a broader issue that Mike brought up on the page here, and that these are instruments of death. At the end of the day, this is a war about killing people, however unfortunate that is. And we can get lost sometimes in the minutiae and the details of it all. But remember, 750,000 Americans did perish in this conflict. And the technology maybe wasn't always where it should have been. But I think what's so interesting in those experimental pieces that you showed us, they were finding ways to perfect killing, essentially, or how to maim people more efficiently and effectively. And,
they were trying. And I don't lack humanism about this. I understand. I'm looking at little lead assassins here, right, that killed and maimed people, and that's, I don't disregard that when I look at these, and how, these things changed lives in the United States forever. That's why, I think the percussion cap needs to get some more attention, because that, as much as these bullets, is what decimated a generation. That combination of that technology goes hand to hand, and it's still decimating people. This because they're using it in the brass cartridges, and you combine the fact you've got, like, I made sort of a flip remark about the kids, but you've got kids producing bullets that go out and kill and maim people, and you know, again, I'm not saying this is earth-shattering research, but I think it is a case of where you could take something simple like this and really think about it and find out a whole new, larger picture because of it, you know?
Yeah, and I think maybe that's a nice closing point. And so, you know, I think what's been so interesting about my job, and I'm an incredibly fortunate person, is I get to interact with people like you, Dana. You know, people who believe in this stuff, who, you know, value material culture, but also in a more creative sociocultural context. And I think, you know, thank you all for tuning in. We had a whole host of really interesting comments and questions. Some, like I said, some very sharp people on here have had some very specific things to say to help guide other participants. So thank you all. Thank you to Dana. Dana took a slice of his time today. Dana's hands are kind of beat up, not because he was in a fist fight, but because he's building a stone wall.
I'm building a stone wall.
Yeah, so you may have thought him this rugged individual, but in fact, he's
yeah. I was conscious of that, but my hands are beat up, and I'm also sunburned, and I've been building a stone wall on my property during this quarantine, and I got a scratch on my nose, and I don't know how the scratch got there, but anyway, I'm sort of bagged up right now. Yeah,
I thought it'd be useful to mention that.
Yeah.
But thank you, Dana, sincerely. Thank you to you all. Stay healthy, stay safe, and everyone be well.
Thank you all for tuning in. I enjoyed talking to you.